Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. I am Kevin Grosso, your host for this episode, and I'm excited to talk with David Miller today about Biblical Greek pedagogy. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So a little bit about David. He began serving at Shepherd's in 2020 as an adjunct professor. Most of his education and personal studies have focused on the historical setting, culture, languages, and philosophies of biblical times. David's THM took on the task of assembling an accurate description of the first century Jewish wedding process through primary sources and identifying how Jesus used the imagery of this wedding to foretell his second coming. His doctoral work focused on assessing current biblical language pedagogy in higher education and determining a contemporary and student-focused approach to using original languages in ministry. But most importantly, David is passionate about mentoring believers to help them strengthen their relationship with Christ and to grow as strong and faithful witnesses to the world around them. David and his wife Elena have been married since 2005 and have 3 wonderful children, Scarlett, Emerson, and Lacey. They are passionate about missions and have devoted much of their marriage to Muslim ministry through outreaches in Turkey and Malaysia and building gospel relationships with Muslims in the Triangle area. So the topic of our conversation today will be David's book, Greek Pedagogy in Crisis. So that title itself, right, says something about your research. So what exactly is in crisis? You say Greek pedagogy is in crisis. So what's in crisis? What is Greek pedagogy, and why is it in crisis?
It's a great question. There's a couple of aspects of that. One, obviously, Greek pedagogy is how Greek is being taught, and I focus that in Christian higher education, religious higher education, so college, seminary, things like that. What I addressed was the method of what's being taught, not necessarily the content, not necessarily the textbooks or the professors themselves, but the actual delivery method of it. So that's why I addressed Greek pedagogy itself, because my issue was with the actual method that's being used. Because in the end, we'll probably get to that. The culprit that I see is the actual delivery method. The crisis that I see is that we are training thousands and thousands of people for ministry every year all over the world. Now, I focus most of my studies here in the U.S. There's a couple people outside of the U.S. but who participated, but we're training thousands of people to do ministry, whether that be as a pastor, as a missionary, as a lay leader, or as an academic. We're training thousands of people to do this, and we require biblical languages for many of them, and yet most students are walking away and losing all of the ability to be able to use those languages really shortly after, if not shortly after the final exam, much less when they get into ministry. It's not actually being utilized. And so we're teaching them these fantastic skills, and then there's this huge drop off. And we're saying, well, is the ministry better off for that? No, the ministry would be better if we were actually using those languages. And so then my question began, how can we help them acquire those language skills better and use them in their ministry?
So the crisis for you then, like how you perceive it, is actually in the result, right? Is the fact that, the methods we're using are leading to results that really no one wants, right? No one would want, their class, as a professor, you wouldn't want your students to walk away learning almost nothing, right? Yeah. 5 years down the line. Right. So the issue is the way we're teaching Greek then isn't producing people that know Greek. I mean, at the end of the day.
Yeah. In the end, kind of the mentality, or one of the analogies I thought of as I started this process was, if I were to ask you to go in a backyard and dig a 2 foot by 2 foot square hole in the yard that's 2 feet deep, for instance, I'd have to give you tools to do that. I'd have to give you the dimensions that I want. The thing that needs to go in that hole needs to fit a certain hole, right? I can't just ask you to dig a hole. You need to dig a specific hole. But then if I give you a snow shovel to dig the hole, yes, it's a shovel, but it's not going to adequately dig the hole. It's going to break. It's not meant for that. So what I looked at and said was, if the goal is to dig the hole, we have to provide the right instruction, the right tools, and make sure the expectations are very clear where you're going, why you're doing this, where the hole's being dug, what the size of the hole is. So with all that, I look at that with languages and say, what do we want the student to be able to do? How can we get them there? And how can we make this process as effective and efficient as possible? And I'm not sure those questions are being asked right now overtly. I think people assume those things are being met. And unfortunately, a lot of people have a snow shovel and they're trying to dig a hole in dirt, and it's not working, and they just give up. And I think that's unfortunate because they need to be able to accomplish the task. And it's our fault if we're not preparing them properly. But if we don't know if we're preparing them properly, we don't know how to fix that. So I'm not, again, I don't want to come across as blaming the professor because I'm not. I think they're fantastic professionals. But if they're, again, if they're handing them a snow shovel, they're not preparing the student properly, and somebody needs to tell them, hey, did you know this shovel isn't the right kind of shovel? And if they know that, hopefully they'll give them a different shovel.
For sure. And I think, again, it's not to blame the professors, right? Because they were most likely handed a snow shovel as well, Yeah. And at the end of the day, it really is, it's a system thing. It's how people are doing this on a macro level. So I want to just, before we get into all the details on your book and the grammar translation method, obviously this topic is very important to you personally. So how does your personal story fit into, this book and your own kind of journey along, how you've studied, Greek language pedagogy? Sure.
I'll start off by saying that I am not a traditional academic in the fact that I'm not smart. So I know a lot of academics who are so good at languages. They love languages. They catch them very easily. They use them very easily, fluidly. I do not. I struggled to learn languages. I struggled, and every time I learn a language, it writes over the old one that I had. So I'm struggling with English right now, and every time I learn something new, it doesn't make that any easier. So I struggled when I have dyslexia. I have a few other kind of learning struggles that I didn't know about early on, but I struggled through Greek. I loved it. I really loved being able to see the context of why Paul wrote a certain way, why Matthew wrote a certain way. I really liked seeing the nuances and the details. The problem was, I just struggled to get the information to stay in my head and to be useful in my head. I'm very practical. I want to make sure I have what I need to use. And so, I struggle with Greek and I realized maybe I'm just not very good at this. Maybe I'm just not very good at languages. And so I put it off. And then I started my THM and, throughout my master's, I had to retake all my Greek. I had to finish Hebrew. I hadn't finished Hebrew at the time. So I redid all of that and realizing, I'm like, okay, I'm seeing how this is working better now that I'm older, now that I have more experience in education and everything. But I still see a gap between what's being presented to me as necessary and how I can functionally use it, practically use it. Mm-hmm. And the more students I talk to and the more friends I talk to who are in ministry, it kept coming back to the same thing. We forgot everything after the final exam. And again, I don't blame the professor. I don't blame the textbook. I don't blame the student. I know a lot of professors I talk to, they said, well, it is a student. The student just needs to put in harder work. The student just needs to, practice more. I understand why they say that. But I practiced a lot. I worked really hard at it. And I know a lot of my friends did too. And they saw the value of what they were doing with those languages. So I know that they appreciated it and they worked at it. And it still didn't, quote unquote, stick. So my idea was, when I went into my doctoral studies, my idea was saying, you know what? I know it's anecdotal to say the process we're using isn't working well. It's not resulting well. But there's so many factors involved with surveying students to find out what the student experience is, because there's so many variables from school to school, much less textbook to textbook and whatever. I realized, I kind of just thought, let's just go to the source. Let's go to the professor, find out their professional thoughts and feelings on it, and see if we can find the gap there. Because, and I told them the same thing with my story. Like, I just struggled with this, and I wanted to make sure that people like me, dyslexia or not, people like me who really want to use this stuff are trained appropriately to use it. Mm-hmm. And I that was the goal of the direction of going, but I really wanted to make sure that there are not dozens and dozens, hundreds and hundreds, thousands and thousands of students who are paying lots and lots of money, thousands of dollars per semester to take languages that they're not going to have in a few months. It just seems like a waste of time, a waste of money, a waste of effort, and really sad that when they get into the ministry, they're not able to use those things appropriately. I wanted to see if we could address something along those lines and maybe fix it so that there's not people like me out there saying, I really wish I could use those things because I paid a lot of money for it and I really want to. I mean, there's a desire there, so a motivation there.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, the primary motivation is obviously to interpret the word of God as it's, as it was originally intended, and all the things involved with with the ministry, whether it be pastoral ministry or translation, and there's just so many things that can be done. So your book focuses on what's called the grammar translation method, right? So I guess the big question, right, is what is that, right? How exactly do you define? So we'll refer to it as GTM. So how exactly do you define the GTM?
Sure. So I actually defined this for all of the professors who took the survey, because several professors I talked to beforehand said, what's a grammar translation? And they've been teaching Greek for 20, 30 years in some cases, and they said, I don't know what that is.
Right.
And then I'll explain it to them and say, oh, yeah, I know that. So I had to define that for a lot of the professors too. Now, again, I don't want to make that sound bad towards the professor, but it's just it's a course technical term. So grammar translation is, the goal is you teach grammar methods or grammar pieces to help translate a language. And that's it. That's it. You're taught grammar on how to translate, and that's it. So the goal of grammar translation method is to translate. A lot of professors use that as saying, oh, we're going to teach you how to read Greek. And so I focused on Greek, so I'll use that as my examples here. But I think this is very relative to Hebrew to some extent as well, even though modern Hebrew is very similar in a lot of ways to biblical Hebrew, as you know. But and so the problem became with grammar translation method, people are saying, well, this helps people read Greek, but nobody can define what reading Greek means. Is it just translating on the fly? Is it actually being fluent in the language? Is it spoken? Are we using this as a live language now? They're not. But that becomes the problem, is you have to define reading if you're going to say reading is the result. Because grammar translation does not lead you to reading. It leads you to translation. That's why Greek 3 or Hebrew 3 tends to be syntax, which is outside of grammar translation method. It's a whole different methodology. So I wanted to hit the very first piece because grammar translation is a simple method. It's very well structured, and it's used all through Bible college. It's used whenever you enter seminary. You're going to do grammar translation, usually for Hebrew and Greek and Latin or whatever language you take that tends to be a dead language. Actually, the United States used to use grammar translation when we taught foreign languages, up until World War I. When we sent our troops over to World War I, we realized these students who've been taking Spanish, French, German, Italian in their high schools for 3-4 years are now in those countries and they can't speak the language.
Right.
And so the U.S. Department of Education stopped using grammar translation and switched over to a rudimentary version of second language acquisition because they realized this isn't a functionable process to help people actually know the language. Now, it still works for dead languages because we tend to use those as a written, translated language. We don't use it as a freely spoken modern language. So, of course, like Sanskrit or something like that. It's not something that's spoken right now. So, therefore, we can use it just as a piece of paper. We have a limited vocabulary. We have a limited process because we have limited documents and texts that use that language. So, For instance, and you know this, there's been tons of people who've said, well, if you know, what's the Greek word for cat? It's like, most Greek scholars don't know that. Why? Because the word cat's not in the Bible.
Right.
And we're only studying the Bible. We're not studying all Koine Greek. We're not studying all ancient Greek. We're just studying what's in Scripture. And so grammar translation allows us to only use the grammar that's found in the New Testament or in the Septuagint, right? It's only used for finite language skills. It's not used to go over to Germany and listen to what a soldier says and repeat it or translate it or to translate road signs. So it's a limited use, which is fantastic, but we're not having success with it for people in ministry, which is the bigger issue.
Well, I think what you said earlier about, you know, it not really preparing people to read, you know, I think that's one of the biggest issues. And even as I think, you know, so my background, you know, I have an MA in linguistics, and my focus was on Bible translation, right? And it's interesting because translation is actually incredibly difficult. I mean, it's actually much, much harder than reading. Reading a text is like child's play compared to doing a really good translation. And so in some ways, I feel like even you know, when we talk about like the grammar translation method, it's more of like a grammar glossing method. You know, it's like you can take a word, you can look it up in the dictionary, and you can correctly gloss it. And, you know, you can look at the translation that's been done before you and you can tweak it on your own, right? But it's like translating actually requires an incredible command of the language, right? It requires you to know, you know, for example, how one word might relate to other words, right? Because when you're that are outside the corpus, right? Because when you're going to translate a particular word, right, you really need to be thinking, how does this word relate to other words that the author could have chosen, right? And those are the kinds of things that I think, you know, in this method, you're not really getting, right? You're not. It's translation in a very specific way is the point. So you've kind of given us a little bit of a history of you know, the grammar translation method, and you've said, you know, that in World War I, right, the U.S. recognized, okay, this isn't teaching people to use the language actively, you know, in their environment. So what are some other like criticisms of the GTM from linguistics more broadly, or just in general in education?
Let me go to some of what the professors said. So, I asked every professor.
This is from your book.
Yes. So I asked every professor, give me at least 5 strengths and 5 weaknesses of grammar translation. Anything you want. And I asked 32 professors, give me 5 and 5. So we have that as a total. And then I categorized those. And so number one thing that people complain about, a weakness of grammar translation method, is that it is artificial and unrealistic. It's not something that is directly applicable to a pastor's ministry. Because 95% or more of the students who are going to seminary, going to Bible college and seminary, are not going on to higher academics. They are not going on to doctorates or THMs. They are stopping at that master's at the highest. So we're using a method that is very academic, not very practical, and that makes it feel very artificial and very unrealistic is how they described it. The next one is it's not understood well. So the first one, the unrealistic artificial one, is about 75%, just over 75% said it was that. The second one's about 66%, still the majority, say that it's also not understood, that the student's not grasping what grammar translation's trying to do. And it could be because, let's say the professor says, hey, we're going to teach you how to read. And they're using grammar translation, and the student's saying, I'm not reading. This
Right.
isn't coming to what I thought it was coming to. Or they say the goal is exegesis, which is great, but that's not the goal of grammar translation. So the student's trying to exegete text, and it's not getting them there. The student's not connecting grammar translation to what the professor says, and that's the not understood part of it. And then there's several more, but the The third one, it's 56%, so it's still over the majority here. Say it's over-structured and too rigid, and so it doesn't have the flexibility to be turned towards a missionary or turned towards a pulpit ministry or a Bible study. It's very difficult to adapt it to different uses. So those are some of the issues, and there's more. There's a lot of memorization is one of the complaints. There's it's very small picture focused, so it's very narrow in its goal. And then the learning style is very blocky. It's very lecture based because of how it's done. All that set aside, those are great numbers and all, but in the end, the number one complaint for every professor that I've talked to, I shouldn't say that. I had a couple of professors in my research that were wildly optimistic about everything. Everything was, oh, I know my students use their Greek. I know my students do this. Oh, I think 90% of them do. The other research and the other 30 professors that I had were like, it's not the case. So I didn't cut out the high. If people were optimistic, that worked into the statistics as well. But the majority of professors I talk to in the survey and just in person say the problem is the student's not using it. The student either forgets it or doesn't apply it or whatever, but in the end, it's not being used. So we're handing them a tool that we tell them is very important. They agree is very important, but in the end, that tool is not being used. It's sitting in the shed getting rusty. And that's their issue. And they don't know who to complain or who to blame. We don't necessarily know who to blame. I think this research has shown who to blame, but in the end, the problem is for most of the professors, okay, it's not working. If it's not being used, then we're wasting time and money and effort. And I don't think any professor would like to hear the numbers and say, listen, we're going to hire you to teach New Testament Greek. Probably about 12 to 14% of your students are actually going to use this, maybe less. The majority of your students are going to squeak by and then forget it afterwards. They're not going to make the connection to how to use it in ministry, but good luck. Most professors are going to say, why would I do that? Why would I keep teaching this for a very small percentage of people to actually use it? It would feel like very futile. And I think that's what a lot of professors are feeling is they don't ask the questions after the course because they know what the answer is going to be. And I think they feel like it would reflect poorly on them, which is unfortunate because I don't think they're doing a bad job. I think they're doing a fantastic job. I think they're using the wrong tool. So the biggest complaint obviously is why isn't it being used? So sorry, that's a very long answer to your short question.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting as I'm just thinking about it, as you just think about like a seminary curriculum, and what the student will actually learn. And, there's a lot of material. So like a theology class, for example, the student is going to take a lot of notes and they're going to forget a lot of that material, right? But they're going to have their notes to go back to, right? And, when something comes up, they can refer back and whatever. And so a lot of it, really is a lot of that sort of process is like, okay, dependent on how well you take notes and, how much you can retain during that short period and whatever. But actually learning a language and really learning a language is a very different kind of thing because it is more like a skill, right? If now, as someone who speaks modern Hebrew, like when someone starts speaking to me in Hebrew, I don't have to go check my notes, right? I just know the language. And so I can just use it. And I think that's the sort of thing. It should actually be much, much easier to retain a language if you've learned the language, as a language, right? Then all you have to do to retain it is read. And that should be quite enjoyable if you can actually read. If you can read a text fluently, then, especially if it's, God's word and you have like a lot of reason to read the book in the original, then it should be something that should be incredibly easy to keep up. If you have that solid foundation, right? If you can read to the point where it's enjoyable and it's, just you see new things in the text. I mean, it should still be exciting,
Sure.
to read the text in the original. So it's just interesting. Like, I mean, I'm hearing you talk, that's the biggest criticism, that it's not being used when really language classes, the fact that they are more skill based, right? Should, if you develop that skill, you should just carry that with you. It's like riding a bike. Once you've got it, like, you can enjoy it, right? But I think that's the whole piece that's missing, right? People at the end of the day, they leave and they don't have that skill. So I think you mentioned, right, that you said you just don't like the grammar translation method in general. So what are the alternatives then? You've mentioned the living language approach. Where can we go from here? Or is in your own research,
I'm not sure there are a lot of options. I'm not sure there are options, to be honest, because I shouldn't say that. You have a baseline, or let's say a concrete foundation that most people will build off of, which is grammar translation. And they will move things and adjust things, and people have done a really good job. And grammar translation has been around for about 500 years, depending on who dates what. But roughly around 500 years, we've been using this similar method, whether it be called classical method or grammar translation. It goes by both names in older times. But in that case, we tend to just rearrange. The foundation stays the same, but we rearrange kind of how the house is built on that foundation. And people are doing a really good job with that. And I know Ben Merkel and Rob Plummer are doing a great job of that. I know Con Campbell is making some really big adjustments. If you've read his new textbook with his former professor, it's very unique, very interesting, but it's still grammar translation, right? Stanley Porter, I mean, I can go through all these textbooks that are up on my shelf here. Everybody's using the same foundation and building a new house on top of it. Mm. And I think the problem is the foundation is old and damaged, and I don't think we can keep patching it. We've been trying that for 500 years, and there's only so long you can do that before you say, you know what, it's probably just easier to break it up and try something new or move to a new location. So I think a lot of people are looking at it and saying, hey, let's do living language. I don't have anything against living language, so I don't want to come across as that, because I don't. And I say this in the book too. My issue isn't with living language. My issue is with living language in general is we don't have the curricula. We don't have the tools or helps. We don't have the backing to show that it works or doesn't work. I know one professor, Gerald Peterman, he spoke at ETS several years ago, and he said he switched to a living language approach for Greek. And I had him when I was at Moody. And he said, I switched to a living language approach. We tried it. We did it for 2 semesters. The students loved it. It was exciting. It was fun. He said, and then I got to the end and realized I have no way of getting them to finish second semester and be ready to start syntax in third semester. He said, I couldn't land the plane. It was his analogy. I had no idea where to go from there. I just had to stop, because living language takes more time. It's not 2 15 or 16 week semesters and then you move on to syntax. It's not even 3. The problem is we don't know how many semesters it takes because we don't have a curricula for it. We don't have textbooks for it right now. And people may be publishing those right now, and maybe I'm not aware of it. But the issue is that's kind of the other option. And so people say, okay, grammar translation or living language. And most professors, turn up their nose at living language, and they just say, that's not going to work. It's like, well, we don't know if it's not going to work. Let's give it some time. Let's put it through some trials. And I know there's some schools, there's one in Boston, Sattler University, I believe it's called. They're doing Greek and Hebrew. Every student's required to do Greek and Hebrew. And those are both done, at least their claim is, both of those are done in complete living language. I don't know how that's going. The school's not that old. And I don't know who they found, because they want one person to teach both Greek and Hebrew as living languages. And I don't know who does that. I know there's a couple of guys who say they can. I don't know how well. But until we get the research, I'm skeptical of it until we can actually prove it, give it some trial runs, see how it works. If it works, fantastic. Let's do it. But the problem is most professors look at it and say, okay, so my options are the same old, or this new radical thing that we haven't seen, we haven't proven. No, we're sticking with the old one.
Yeah.
They don't look at they don't look to create something. They don't look for any kind of a middle ground or any kind of adjustments. We're in some ways we're rearranging, chairs on the Titanic. We're not going to find the right seating arrangement. right? That's not going to save the ship. They may look better. It may be more comfortable for people, but again, it's not saving the sinking ship. And I think people are doing great jobs. You look at Daily Dose of Greek and Daily Dose of Hebrew, fantastic tool. It's probably one of the best things I've seen that help people with languages. It's well done, and it's groundbreaking, I think, in a lot of ways for tools. But I know Plummer Merkle just put out, probably, I think it was a year ago, they put out a new Introduction to Greek textbook, and it's grammar translation. Mm-hmm. And I know Ben Merkle well, and I know Rob Plummer to some extent. He was involved in the research. And again, I like what they're doing, but I don't want to pick on them, but it's a new approach. It's this fresh idea, but it's still grammar translation with some chairs moved around.
Right.
And my question is, okay, if and both of those gentlemen took place in my survey, and they got all the results to it. And the question is, if the ship is sinking, if you've admitted this isn't working, and they did overwhelmingly, the professors I put on there, which is 600 some years of experience between the 32 of them. If that consensus is the ship is sinking, grammar translation is not effective. If that's the case, why are we still publishing textbooks with grammar translation? Why aren't we trying things? Maybe we need to dump all the money and effort into living language. Maybe we just need to dump all the money and effort and time into exploring new approaches. And so the short answer to that is that's one of the things I did in chapter 5 of my book was I presented a skeleton of how to start teaching Greek pointed at exegesis rather than pointing at translation. Whether it works or not, I don't know. I've had a couple of schools ask me to do it, but they never really give me a full leash and say, yeah, let's try it. Usually it's like, okay, can you mesh what you do with grammar translation, keep the foundation, just put your house on top? And I'm like, I don't think that's effective. And so I haven't done that for any college because I don't think it's helping the students. I think it's charging the students a lot of money and taking a lot of their time for something that we know is not going to work. So I haven't done that in a classroom yet. I'd love to see if it works. It may fail, but at least it's the idea of saying, let's start a conversation. Let's start moving and see if we can get something going that's better than grammar translation. But that's asking a lot of people who've been teaching the same way for 15, 20, 25, 30 years, asking them to redo the entire process of how they teach Greek is a big ask. So I understand there's going to be, and there is, some resistance to that. But if really our only choices are right now, quote unquote, proven, tried and true, old fashioned grammar translation, or what people say is this wacky, crazy living language, or anything, they're going to stick with grammar translation until we start putting out some meat somewhere else. But again, that's going against the grain quite a bit. So it'll take the right person doing it.
Hey, this is Nick with Biblingo, and I hope you're enjoying this podcast series on biblical language pedagogy. If you're a teacher, faculty, or a student that would like to see these pedagogical principles implemented at your institution, then we have a special event for you. On May 13th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, we're hosting a webinar called How to Enhance Your Biblical Language Program with Biblingo. We'll show you how you can leverage these proven language learning methods in your biblical language program using the Biblingo software and our supplemental resources. Click the link in the description or go to biblingo.org/webinar to register for the event.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think part of the issue is that the people view it as a dichotomy. People view grammar translation or a living language. And I think that's, something that you had mentioned. I can't remember his name, the professor that did the living language. He tried it out for a couple semesters.
Oh, Gerald Peterman. Yeah.
Yeah. So, that's something like, okay, but then when you get to the end, they don't know what nominative case is. And so how do I teach them syntax? Right. Or I don't know if, that's obviously a made up example, but like the point being that there are certain things about grammar translation that are good.
Yes.
Being able to explain the grammar actually does help you to place categories. As a second language learner, you really, you shouldn't be learning. I know some people would disagree with this, but you shouldn't be learning a language in the way that you learn your first language, right?
Mm-hmm.
A child takes, a year. I have a 1-year-old who knows about 5 words, right? Maybe 10 words, and that's fine, But I don't want to learn 5 or 10 words in a year, Yeah. and I want to be able to speak, and I want to be able to use the language like very, very quickly, and I can actually, look at something like a paradigm, like I can see accusative case, and I can see, oh, okay, like this is how it works. He can't do that, right? He has to intuit it through thousands and thousands and thousands of repetitions. And so I think part of the issue is that it is kind of presented as a dichotomy where, we have to, either don't talk about the grammar, or we do, and do living language, or we just do all grammar and translation all the time. And but to your point, I think the big issue is, what is the foundation here, and what is the goal? And I think that's a great question that we need to be asking. And then what are the results, right? And those are the big questions that I think, like you point out, that we're really not asking. What are we getting out of this? And what is the goal? What are we trying to get out of this? So I think at this point, we've talked about several of these things that I've listed in my questions already. So maybe we can just get practical a little bit. So I'm just mentioning this in the preface of your book. You say that part of the question you're trying to answer is why Greek students do not retain their language skills. So we've talked about this, right? So why do you think that is the case? And what do you think? I mean, you said that the professor, right, would say, well, the student is to blame because they just don't keep it up. So why do you think students aren't sort of maintaining that motivation to continue in the language?
I think it's because they don't use it. I think we're giving them, my assessment is that if you teach somebody how to work on a car, I keep using manual labor or things like this as illustrations because it seems to apply easily. But if you teach somebody how to work on a car and you give them this whole tool chest full of all the tools they need, wrenches and screwdrivers and everything they need, you give them all that stuff. And you can train them how to use every single tool. But if all they ever do is replace alternators or replace batteries or do tune-ups, there's going to be a lot of tools that don't get used. Are we going to be surprised in 4 months, 6 months, a year, if we pull out a certain wrench and say, what's this for? We're going to say, I don't know. I mean, I know you showed me what it was for, but I haven't used it in the last year. So I'm really not sure what it's for or how to do this job because I've never done that job. You just kind of walked me through it. So I think the problem is we're not giving the students a practical way of using Greek in this case, or biblical languages in general. We're not giving them the practical aspect. We're teaching them grammar translation in its core is an academic approach to learning a language. We are simply learning how to, like you said, to translate. What a lot of my professors said is we're basically decoding. We're teaching students to decode Greek and Hebrew, which is a very simple process, but it does not help them apply it. It simply helps them understand that ploion means boat, right? But does it matter that ploion used to mean small boat? Does it matter in 1 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians 3:15 and 16, where Paul says, this I taught you as of most importance, that Jesus Christ, according to the scriptures, was crucified, he was buried, and on the third day, according to the scriptures, he rose again, right? Does it matter that Paul used aorist tense for crucified, aorist tense for buried, and perfect tense for rose from the grave? It certainly does. It makes a big difference because perfect tense means it's something that happened in the past, but it's still ongoing. That's an incredible thing. He shouldn't have done that. He should have used the aorist 3 times, right? But he broke kind of the rule and he switched to perfect tense to make a theological point. We don't get that in English. We can't translate that into English without adding a bunch of stuff. So does it matter that we do this properly? Yes, it does. But Do we show the student? Do we teach the student how to look for those things? Why those things are important? No. What we do in grammar translation, now we may do that in syntax. We may do that in exegesis courses later, like Greek 4, Greek 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. The problem is when most students are required to take 6 to maybe 9 credit hours of a language, the vast majority, so either 100% or 2/3 of that, 66% if you didn't go to a public school like me. The majority of that is going to be grammar translation, which is memorize paradigms, memorize vocabulary, and learn how to mix those two things together with some rules, and you can kind of decode this verse. Does that bring out the theological significance of what Paul says in 1 Corinthians? No, it doesn't. It can if the professor shows you that. But are you going to get that on your own just by doing exercises and practices at home? No. So we're teaching them in a very academic approach. We're teaching them to memorize and start to combine things in order to come up with the solution, which is a translation. And then we'll attach syntax to that later, which is great. But and every professor tells you at the end of Greek 1 and Hebrew, or Greek 2 and Hebrew 2, you need to take syntax. Like, yes, I agree, but the school doesn't require it, which means the vast majority of students aren't going to take it.
Right.
So either the school needs to change the requirements, and we need to start doing, for instance, Dallas. If I remember right, Dallas requires 5 semesters of Greek and Hebrew, like 5 of each, which is fantastic. They really know languages. That's a great goal. So either every school needs to adopt something similar to that, which they're not going to, or they need to change their approach, which is the issue. We need to start telling them, listen, a small percentage, probably less than 5% of you, are going on to higher academics where you're going to use Greek and Hebrew at a higher academic level. So 95% of you or so, why would we give them an academic approach? It's a waste. It really is a waste. We're giving them really good tools that they can't use because they're not taught how to use them outside of an academic setting. We could be doing an exegetical approach. And I'm not suggesting mine is the right approach. I'm just saying, let's start a conversation and start analyzing this from a different aspect. If we're looking at this and saying, at the end, I want you to exegete the text. I want you to pull out the meaning and apply it to your congregation, or apply it to your Bible study, or apply it to the people that you're ministering to on the mission field. If we teach them how to specifically do those things, they very logically should be able to do it because they're going to use it right away. They're going to apply it immediately. It's not, oh yeah, I forgot. What was it? O, ace, ain, et, ama. Right. So they're not just going to go through all those and say, oh, okay, this is dative, or this is whatever. This is third person plural. That stuff doesn't make a big difference. And honestly, they can buy Logos and hover over that word, and it gives them all that information. Right. So do they really need to memorize all the diagrams and all the things? Honestly, in my opinion, no. We have great technology. So if we give them things they can use today and every day, like how to do a proper word study, not a long one, at least understanding the elements of it, how to do proper diagramming, verbal aspect, looking for textual critical items and things like that can show us variance. If they know how to at least look for those things, then they'll say, "Oh, this one has a variant. I should look up whether that's important or not." They could do that every single week, even in an abbreviated fashion. I think it would stick better.
So I think though that the goal, if you were to ask a professor, well, you probably know this, right? If you were to ask professors what is the goal of their teaching, I would assume it would normally be exegesis or reading, right? Is that fair that people would say that? Regardless of method.
Yeah.
We know their method, right? We know that their method is GTM, right? Mm-hmm. But would they say that the goal would be exegesis and reading?
So that's one of the questions I asked. So in the book, and so in my book, I put a lot of graphs in there because I'm very visual. So I don't like reading a lot. I much prefer movies. So one of the things that I asked was, what's the learning objective of your course? What are you trying to get them to do, or what are they doing? Like, what are the skills they're learning the most in your class from your method? Number one, 84%. And again, you have to consider, at least 2 of my 32 people were wildly optimistic about things.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so but they're included in this. But 84% said memorization. The number one thing you get out of their course, the number one thing you do in that course is memorization, which is true. You have paradigms, you have vocabulary. There's a lot of things to memorize.
But is that a goal or like a...
That's one of the outcomes.
Okay.
That's what they walk away with. So the second one, 69%, translation.
Huh.
The third one, 28%, is reading. They say, my goal is that they can read when they walk out. That's what I push. That's what I test. The last one on that list, 6% of the professors said exegesis. 6% of these 32, 600 plus years of experience say exegesis is the outcome. That's what we're shooting for, is we want them to have exegesis. I was shocked by that number. I really assumed that would be number one.
Yeah.
For some reason, it's not, unless some people just assumed exegesis was a given, and then they didn't say that in the answer, which is certainly a possibility. But again, 6%, that's a pretty small number. So I think they probably want that, but they didn't express that overtly or even covertly in answering the same question in the survey.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, given that you would think that our, in the actual classroom, people would be taught how to memorize things.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually a ton of research on how to memorize things effectively.
Yeah.
And that kind of research isn't really utilized in the grammar translation method. I mean, it's, spaced repetition. I interviewed Paul Nation several weeks ago, and, he said depth of processing and, repetition. And those are really the two big things. But again, those aren't the kinds of things that you get in the classroom. So I'm going to assume, though, that most professors, if you were to ask them something like, do you think it is a good goal for, someone to walk away from Greek or Hebrew as a better exegete? I mean, I would assume they would say yes, right? And I think that's obviously your concern, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think we can change the classroom to help students become better exegetes?
It's a great question. I think, so when you talk about learning objectives, and so I came at this as an approach from teaching, right? Pedagogy. And so when we talk about learning outcomes, so what we want to see at the end, when they walk away from the class, they have these things in their belt or in their pocket, right? One, in order for it to be a learning objective, it needs to be measurable. And 2, it has to be measured. And those seem very close, of course they are, but they're very distinct, because you can say, and I've had syllabi that I've gotten in courses that say, we want you to have a deeper relationship with Jesus. Great. How are you measuring that? That's not a learning objective.
Right.
It's a great goal, but you can't measure it, and 2, you aren't measuring it.
Yeah.
And if you don't have those 2 things, it's not a learning objective. So if we could say, well, we want them to exegete. Great. What's your measurement for exegesis? How are you measuring that exegesis? Or if your goal is for them to be able to read, what does reading mean? Right? You have to be able to measure it. And 2, are you asking them to read? And I had one professor who's very well known. He does a great job. He's a really great guy. And he said, my objective is for them to read. My courses are called Reading New Testament Greek, or Learning to Read New Testament Greek. And I know that's a textbook for David Allen Black, and it's not David Allen Black I'm talking about. But anyways, and I asked him, I did a follow-up with him because he had some interesting points. And I said, how do you measure whether they can read or not? And he said, I have a verbal test at the end of each semester where they have to stand in front of me and read New Testament Greek. So great. That's the only person out of several people that said reading is the goal that actually tested the reading. They actually measured the reading. Everyone else just uses that as a catchphrase. We throw it out there that, we're going to teach you how to read New Testament Greek. Okay, but are you measuring that? Because we are in an academic setting.
And even that is very, qualitative. You could measure the reading speed, the comprehension. There's all kinds of things that people do in other languages to measure.
Does reading mean to translate out loud?
Right.
Like, is that what you're measuring as reading? And that's what, when I had Gerald Peterman for Romans at Moody, he would teach from his Greek New Testament, and he would read passage of Romans. He's reading the Greek New Testament, and he's speaking in English, right? So is that reading? That's the problem. Nobody had a clear definition of whether that was reading or if that's just translating on the fly or translating out loud. So in my case, I looked at it and said, my goal is exegesis. And so I'm not sure if I put this in the book or if I just use this for a presentation. Either way, when you're planning a trip, so I have a family. So I have a wife and 3 kids. If I'm planning a trip, it's really important to know where I'm going. Because I live in North Carolina. If all I'm doing is going down to Myrtle Beach, then it's a long drive. So I may go there for more than a day. It's not just going to be a day trip. So I have to plan on what we're packing, what vehicle we're taking, how much gas we need, how much food we have to pack, how much money we need to budget. It's a whole different set of things if we're going to Colorado or California or Florida or Texas. I have to know those things because some cases I need to buy plane tickets instead of fill my tank with gas. But if we don't know what the end goal is, then we can't appropriately pack or appropriately prepare. Most people are saying we start with grammar translation and see where it goes. That's not the way to do it. We have to start with the end goal, and this is what everybody says for course design. Course design is you start with the end, and then you draw a straight line sort of thing, right? And so that's what I did. I ended with exegesis. I want the student to exegete. How can I best get them to exegete? I don't care about grammar. If grammar translation comes into play, great. If it doesn't, no problem. And I did take some things from grammar translation because I think there's some good strengths there. But I think there's weaknesses there we can get rid of. So I don't think throwing the baby out with the bathwater obviously is wise. But grammar translation's goal is translation. That's the destination of their trip. I don't think translation's appropriate. And most professors that I asked that question to, do you want them to translate? They said no. They will, but that's not the end goal. That's not my desire. I'm like, okay, well then why are you using a method? The end goal is translation. Your desire is not for translation. Why are you using that method? So it's like, well, I don't want to drive 4 days to get to Utah or California, whatever it is. Okay, then why are you loading your car? If you don't want to drive 4 days, you should take a plane. You should not be loading your car for that drive. So I just kept seeing it and saying, why aren't we saying, if we want exegesis, because I think that's what they want, whether they use the word exegesis or whatever, in the end, I think that's what every professor wants. They want them to draw out the accurate meaning of the text, right? So whether they articulate it in that fashion or not, I know that's what in their heart, that's what their goal is. But the issue is, okay, so what's your plan to get there? Because grammar translation does not get you there. Grammar translation is taking you to Minnesota. If your goal is to go to Colorado, you're on the wrong road. Like, that's the problem. If you're driving north, you are going the wrong direction from North Carolina to Colorado, right? So that's what I keep thinking is, why are you driving north if your goal is to go west? And the answer is, oh, well, we've always gone north. Like, right. So that's a horrible answer. But they say, well, this is how I was taught and I learned it well. So if my students learn it, if the students do what I did, they will learn it like I did. And I think you and I both know, and probably a lot of people listening here know, some people are just good at it. And you could just throw all the Greek vocabulary words on a floor, and in 2 weeks, the person would know how to translate. They don't need guidance. They don't need structured effort, right, or goals. They can just do it. Some people are just great at that. And some people struggle. And honestly, most people struggle. As we know from second language acquisition, most people struggle, much less we're talking about dead languages or research languages. So for the professor just to assume, you do what I do, you'll be fine. Well, that was, not to get into the long illustration, but that was Michael Jordan's issue. Michael Jordan in 91, 92, 93, when they won the first 3 championships for the Chicago Bulls, he complained on why his teammates were not as good as him. He's like, all you have to do is do what I do, practice as much as I do, and do all these kind of things. And then he was frustrated with his teammates for years. Then he went and played baseball, and he put in tons of effort, and he didn't succeed. And he came back to the NBA for 3 more championships, and he was a whole different person, according to his teammates. He was not pressuring them and saying, because he realized he's special, he's different. I think if professors thought of it that way and said, you know what, maybe I'm just special, maybe I just learn languages better than most people, then they would look at the student to design their course rather than looking at themselves or their past to design the course. And I think they'd have a whole different result.
Yeah, that's interesting. So just a couple of questions just to wrap up here.
Sure.
So we talked a lot about kind of the field and where people are at, and there is genuine dissatisfaction across the board for the most part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Other than the two outliers,
Yeah.
right? So let me ask you, do you see any more recent trends in, you wrote the book in 2019, so it's pretty recent, but do you see any more recent trends in biblical language pedagogy that have changed since you wrote the book that you find to be encouraging, and you think like, oh, maybe we're headed in the right direction or in the wrong direction?
Yeah, I think the majority of people are still on the track of rearranging the ships on the Titanic. I think there's several people still sticking with grammar translation. Now, there's people like, I'm going to forget his name. I forgot his first name. Bird, Dr. Bird. He does singing New Testament Greek, and he said he's had really good success with people. It's still using grammar translation, but he sings it instead of just speaking it. And okay. Like I said, Daily Dose of Greek and Hebrew, that's a fantastic tool that we've never had before. And it's the people I've used it, and the people I've talked to who've used it say that it's really incredible. It really helps you with 2 minutes a day to see Greek. That's great. Again, those are all grammar translation. And Con Campbell's textbook, I think it came out in 2017, not new. He and his former professor did. It's actually got what they call a PPP approach to it. It actually has a pedagogy built into grammar translation. That's great. Still grammar translation, but it's a different approach, which is unique and interesting. Outside of that, I would say this. People are becoming more and more comfortable with living language approach. And that's great. Again, I have nothing against living language approach. I'd like to see more people getting involved and more people starting to do the research and do the practical side of it. And if they put that stuff out, if they get the documentation done, if they get it out and test it, if they can actually put it in a package. And I know we're not all going to be academics. We're not all going to go to school. But lots and lots and lots of churches are requiring an MDiv to get a job there. Lots of religious organizations in general want you to have education. So we do have to cater to that to some degree.
Sure.
But so that means it has to be packaged in a 16 week block somehow. 2-3 courses. You have some schools that are down to requiring 3 credit hours of one language or another for an MDiv. There are some that are saying 6 of each, some that are saying 6 of one, 9 of another, some that are saying 3 of one, 6 of another. There's a lot of variation there because they want to slim the degrees down so they can get more students. And of course, if you remove the hard stuff, you'll get more students. People tend to shy away. People tend to go to MA. MA is a lot to avoid an MDiv because they want to avoid languages. With all that said, people are leaning more towards the what used to be considered radical of the living language approach. We might find out in 5-10 years living language just doesn't work for Greek. We might find out it works fantastic. We just need to tweak this and adjust this. And do they really need to know the word for cat or urine or whatever? Okay, no. So we can cut out some things, and it speeds the process up. So I'm seeing a lot of people where it used to be taboo to talk about living language approach, that people are now, and of course Biblingo is doing this too, which is fantastic. It's exploring it, it's trying it, saying let's do it. Let's at least jump in here, get involved. Let's put a product out there. If it works, great. And as we're moving along, we start tweaking, sanding, polishing, making adjustments to do well. And at the end, if it doesn't work, it's going to peter out. That's what always happens in academics. But I shouldn't say that because grammar translation hasn't petered out.
Well, there hasn't been an alternative, which is the issue, right?
Yeah, exactly. So I am seeing people who've read my book and who've contacted me who say, this is interesting. Can you give me more? Have you done this in a classroom? Have you seen... Can you prove if this works or not? And so people are interested in new ideas. They used to not be, that sounds terrible. They haven't always been open to new ideas. And I think now people are getting more used to these exploring new options, which is great because my point was in the book, I want to show that there's an issue. I want to publish and prove that it's not just hearsay. Right? It's not just rumors out there that this isn't quite working. Now it's proof. It's been researched. It's been datatized. It's been published. It's out there. And a lot of professors I talked to said, I am so glad you're doing this because I have been trying to talk to my school for 15 years about changing how we do Greek, but they won't believe me. So I'm really glad somebody's doing this research to put it in paper, put it in numbers. So people are starting to see some momentum in trying new things. I haven't seen a lot of people yet veering away from grammar translation. They're trying to get more creative with grammar translation, which is good. But again, I think they're trying to patch things up a little too much. So I like the move towards living language because it's showing some guts. It's showing some ingenuity. And I at least want to see if it's going to work or not. And we don't know that if we don't try it. And for years we haven't tried it. Yeah. I know some people who have tried it and their school rebuked them and told them they can't use it anymore. And again, I know like Gerald Peterman, he tried it and he realized it's not functional yet. We have more work to do before we can try this again. So I like that people are trying that to at least find out one way or the other, whether it's good or not. And then we can make adjustments from there.
That's great. So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Languages podcast. Thank you, David, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages podcast brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.